Hey, everybody. Welcome back to That Makes Sense, the podcast where we discuss the wide-sweeping impact of consumer trends. It's still July, so some, including myself, say that summer is still in full swing. However, for students and parents, the time has come to start preparing for the upcoming school year. Unlike last year, when schools were pretty undecided between remote, virtual, and hybrid, many schools and universities have already announced their plans for the school year, and a large portion of students will be gearing up to return to physical classrooms. So will school supply lists look similar to 2019? When, where, and how are people planning to do their school shopping? In our last two episodes, we explored how pandemic-influenced consumer behaviors impact both the food and healthcare industries. So, what consumer behaviors and preferences are going to be in play for retail going back into back-to-school shopping? To answer those questions and get a sense of what we can expect in the coming weeks, Deloitte surveyed 1,200 parents of school-age children on their shopping plans. The good news is the outlook for the season is bright, with spending set to increase by 16%. To find out why that is, and really delve into the survey findings, I'm going to share excerpts from a new episode from our friends over at the Press Room podcast by Deloitte Insights. You'll hear from Rod Sides, Vice Chairman and leader of Deloitte's U.S. retail practice, who produced this survey with his team. Kate Ferrara, who leads the retail sector for Deloitte's risk and financial advisory practice, and podcast host Tanya Ott. They break down the survey findings and highlight how some of these new trends may impact retailers. Let's see what they have to say.
Well, we were expecting a lot of parents to roar back in with their wallets and be able to try to make up for last year. And that's exactly what we're finding.
So overall, we see spending up about 16% year over year from last year, which is a big jump. The average back to school spend per child is about $612 per student. And 40% of the households that we surveyed expect to spend more on back to school items than they did last year.
When you did your survey last year, just 17% of respondents said they were more confident in the economy's prospects. Now, that number is up dramatically this year, and I was surprised to see that 78% said they were either in a similar or better shape than they were last year. What do you make of that number?
I think a lot of it has to do with the stimulus packages that went in place. A lot of folks have stockpiled some cash along the way. And so I think they believe that they're at least poised to return to the school year with a little more in their pocket, and the prospects of seeing things like retail sales, et cetera, pick up in the back half of the year. I think many economists and probably many consumers felt like that once we were able to raise the controls or what have you from allowing people back in the marketplace, that we would see that kind of a rebound. And I think that's why the prospects are up so much year over year.
I also think this time last year, again, so much uncertainty of what the school year was going to look like. And I think, with the economy and questions about the economy, people just were spending less as well. Didn't perhaps need as much apparel or shoes, some of the, traditional back to school items that we typically see. There was a lot of remote learning going on or being planned for too. So I think it's also a combination of less spend last year, as well as people just feeling a lot more positive about their own personal financial situation, as well as the economy.
Well, Bobby here, I'd like to jump in with my 2 cents. You've seen across many industries how the pandemic has forced all of us to embrace the use of technology and digital in our daily lives. And, just my past 2 episodes of That Makes Sense, we looked into how the food industry and healthcare industry went digital. So schools and colleges did the same in a big way as well. And I think going into this school year, we'll see that digital adoption reflected in the products that parents have to buy for their children to succeed.
The absolute biggest percentage jump was technology. So while there was sort of a modest 2% growth in more traditional products, so things like school supplies, your pens, your pencils, apparel, the biggest jump was in electronics, computers, hardware. We saw a 37% year over year jump in things around technology products and only a 2% jump in the traditional products. So I think that's a trend that is not surprising, given, again, the fact that we still could have some hybrid learning next year. And also, even if students are fully in the classroom, I think a lot of these students are just used to a more digital learning experience. So, using the portals, using some apps that they used last year. I know for my own children, I mean, they're really using the technology more and more, and they've gotten used to that. So that was probably one of the biggest changes that we saw this year in the survey, and how much the digital learning has really propelled the technology spend this year.
The other thing that's kind of interesting in that space is that a lot of the elementary schools started to really use technology in a way that we hadn't seen before. So I have friends and colleagues who talked about the fact that tech was being now integrated even at the kindergarten level, which is quite amazing when you think about it. However, a lot of kids are really ready to use it at this point because we do expose them so early.
What I found maybe a little bit surprising, at least to me, was that the tech spend was up so dramatically, or is expected to be up so dramatically this year. I would have thought that people would have already purchased the laptops and the tablets and all the other technology last year.
I think they probably did make some of those purchases, but at that point, we didn't know how permanent this change would really be. And so I think there was some of that rebounded. I also believe that we're seeing a major growth in, say, the middle income folks making those investments. We looked at the pickup of tech spend among kind of that middle cohort, which is $50,000 to $100,000. We saw that grow dramatically. And so what that told us is that that group of individuals didn't necessarily invest last year, but they know they're going to have to this year. And that really propelled a lot of the growth as well. Yeah, the other thing that's interesting is that when we look at things like digital subscriptions for learning aids, et cetera, that also continues to stay high and has continued to grow year over year. The interesting thing about that is that you would expect that to subside as we go back to quote unquote normal classrooms. If you remember last year, there was a fair amount of anxiety around the quality of education that perhaps the kids were getting. What that says is that parents were able to supplement some of those online learning. They have stayed with that. And so they continue to make those investments on behalf of their kids so they get the extra help they need, but in a digital environment.
We've also faced some real issues with supply chain. What types of school supplies are being most affected by supply chain issues?
I think there's been interesting shortages that we see across a number of products, not just what we were dealing with paper products last year, but shelves themselves are not quite as full as they've been in the past. That's really driving a lot of the parents to start to shop earlier.
One of the things I think that could be a bright spot for some of our retailers. I mean, 59% of the spend is going to happen before the end of July. And we realize that, certainly different parts of the country, school systems go back at different times. Anytime you can get a customer to start shopping earlier, generally they're going to spend more. So I think, to the extent that, get people in the stores, get a promotional early, get people starting to shop early, that could also be a bright spot for retailers in terms of overall spend.
And that's a move forward of about 2 to 3 weeks is from what we normally see. So it's just interesting how shoppers are pretty attuned to the challenges they're seeing manifest themselves that a lot of retailers have had to deal with.
It's interesting. We've seen shortages of all kinds of products, from workout gear to tents to home improvement supplies over the past year or so. What was really surprising to me from the findings was that the category of traditional supplies, things like backpacks, pens, papers, markers, would only be up 2%. That seems pretty small compared to the jump for tech category. Maybe more from Kate and Rod on that.
So when we look at tech, it's much broader than just, a laptop that you might bring to school. It's some of the software that goes along with it, the subscriptions, as well as just kind of the manifestation of wearables, of mobile, and everything that goes along with that. And I think that's getting younger and younger. I mean, we're certainly seeing that driving down even to the elementary levels.
Things like casual wear, we expect to be down 10% year over year. But uniforms and shoes, we expect to be up. So it really is an interesting look at the subcategories in terms of how we expect them to perform. So in general, the spending across every category is going to be up, but there are going to be pockets of winners and losers like we always see.
There's a couple of key insights that came from the survey. I mean, I think one is this real movement towards athleisure, which is not a new thing. The leggings and the comfortable clothes. But I think certainly most people who have spent most of the past year or so at home have gotten used to a much more casual attire. And but I also think, there is a bit of pent up demand with some of the apparel. And so some of those students that maybe didn't, get a new wardrobe last year because they weren't back in school, or get those new shoes that they're going to wear on the first day of school last year. I do think that we'll certainly see an uptick in that. And the other piece that came out of our survey, which I think is interesting, is with some of our higher income respondents, they're certainly interested in fashion and spending more money, and particularly around that athleisure concept that I had talked about, and kind of moving more towards fashion. We saw that again a little bit more with the higher income respondents, but I think certainly something for retailers to keep an eye out, because I think people are out there and they're ready to spend for their kids to go hopefully back to the classroom in September.
I think all of us saw our spend on clothing, at least clothing we'd wear out in public, go down over the pandemic. Well, I think this is a time of the year where we're going to see a lot more spending on apparel for that first day of school, that first week back. Now, where will parents go to shop for those items? Well, one maybe unexpected player is thrift store, especially for that fashion and apparel. While that might not be surprising if you are the parent of a teenager, it may surprise some of you for the younger kids. And of course, online is going to continue to be a super popular channel. You might be wondering, well, are parents going to continue to shop online to the extent that they recently have? Well, this might be a permanent shift in the way people like to get their shopping done.
I think it's interesting that thrift in general has made that kind of a return. And I do think it's something in the generation. But when we looked at who was going to use the thrift channel, this year we were up to about 22% of folks looking for fast fashion there. And again, 19% of the folks said they expected to be in those stores on a regular basis. And that was up from 9% last year. And you might have thought about, given the economic uncertainty last year, that probably would have flipped. But perhaps it's because there were so many places that were on lockdown, you really couldn't get out to get to the thrift store. So I do think we're going to see more and more folks shop that particular area. I know my son, who just graduated from college, that was his favorite place to shop during college. When we asked folks about preferred channel, certainly stores continue to be number one, but close on the heels are online. So we saw this movement last year, obviously with all the challenges, where those two lines started to converge. But what we're finding this year is about 43% of the total spend is expected to be in store, 39% is expected to be online. So that's up 2% from last year. It was 37% last year. So I think we have seen a fundamental shift here. What we were watching for a number of years is that the back to school season was one that was predominantly in store just because it was easier, et cetera. I think what has happened is parents have figured out that, yeah, I can shop for my kids online. It's easier, it's faster in certain respects. And I think we're seeing a permanent shift here. I don't see it going back. What we normally find during a downturn is that behaviors that were trending tend to accelerate. And I think in this instance, we found the acceleration of online over the last 18 months, and I think it's here to stay.
I think another thing we all saw during the pandemic was the rise of shopping within social platforms, right? Hitting that checkout button right in an influencer or a friend's post is something that's pretty tempting and getting more and more common by the day. And I would say another noteworthy takeaway from the survey is around the technologies that consumers are embracing and integrated into their shopping journeys. So voice assistants, digital wallets, AR, being able to try a product on, or at least see what it might look like in your house or in your room before you bought it. And now, as I mentioned, social media. It's of course not new, but for some consumer groups, scouring product reviews on social media is an important step before purchasing. It's a place to get inspiration for products, as you've seen recently. It can also single-handedly revive the popularity of a seemingly random product like a logo sweatshirt. So, what does this mean for the back-to-school period and how social could impact that?
Well, that's an interesting discussion. And so for the back-to-school, school-age parents, we find that they are going to use social media really in a few ways this year that maybe they haven't in the past. And so certainly they want to be able to check out, prices and offers, et cetera. But recommendations are also a big part of what they are looking for around that. And so we're finding that the use of social has continued to rise this year, probably more than we've seen in the past. And so that one is kind of interesting as we're looking at how things have evolved in the market. Now, one of the things that we're doing with our Back to College is we're comparing and contrasting how much social media use is there for that group of parents who typically a little bit older, and they don't rely on it near as much. So, for instance, About 44% of our respondents for back to school said they would use social media, but only about 22% in the back to college. So that just tells you there's a little bit of a generational gap, and we're a little bit in transition in terms of how folks are using the technology to find the right products, find the right price, et cetera. So to me, that was a really interesting finding. When we get into emerging technologies, what we find is use of digital wallets about the same. Okay, so roughly 15%, 17% of total respondents today would use that. But when we get into things like using voice assistants, back to school parents are much more comfortable using voice assistants than are the back to college. When we look at buy buttons on social media posts, again, by 2-to-1, the back to school parent is much more comfortable with that than, say, the back to college. Using AR, VR, same thing. It's almost a 2-to-1 advantage for those who are using back to school. So again, I do think it's a little bit generational in terms of what we're seeing here, but that to me is one of the most fascinating things that came out of these 2 studies we did this year.
And I would just add to what Rod said. I mean, I think this past year, with just people getting more used to using technology, sort of being forced to use it, and we've had this technology component to our survey for the last few years, and I think it's slowly we've seen at least a trend that it's slowly starting to increase in terms of people actually using it in a meaningful way during their shopping experience. But this year was a really big leap. That's really good news, but something that the retailers should be paying attention to as they start thinking about how to modify their shopping experience, both in store and online.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that last call out from Kate. And I do want to reemphasize the other big takeaways from the research, which both Kate and Rod called out for retailers entering this season. First, and maybe foremost, is the shift to digital. That really is here to stay, and retailers need to continue to meet that consumer demand. Then there's the generational element as well. Well, current parents of school-age kids are really the ones using social media and shopping technology most. In about 10 years, they'll be sending their kids off to college. So there's an opportunity for retailers to set up for that. In the meantime, they do still have to figure out how to appeal to both groups of consumers simultaneously. Those who can do that are pretty likely to win. The other big one isn't a shocker because retailers have been facing this challenge for quite a while, but they've got to continue to focus on the supply chain. With consumers having so much choice over where to shop, it's super important to make sure you're not driving customers away with stockouts or unavailable products. For back to school, since it's such a short window, you've got to have the items people really want: the tech, the apparel, and the traditional school supplies. That does it for our special feature on back to school today. You can find the full episode by searching for The Press Room Podcast by Deloitte Insights. You can check out their other episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss anything. And remember, this was just a high-level take of the back to school and back to college surveys. There's a heck of a lot more data to check out. You find them at Deloitte.com/insights. That does it for this episode of That Makes Sense. I hope you'll join me next time when we explore another topic that's critical to the consumer industry. Thanks a lot. See you soon. You can listen on your favorite podcatcher, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. Simply search for That Makes Sense. Connect with me on social media, Bobby Stevens on LinkedIn or @BobbyStevens on Twitter. This presentation contains general information only, and Deloitte is not, by means of this presentation, rendering accounting, business, financial, investment, legal, tax, or other professional advice or services. This presentation is not a substitute for such professional advice or services, nor should it be used as a basis for any decision or action that may affect your business. Before making any decision or taking any action that may affect your business, you should consult a qualified professional advisor. Deloitte shall not be responsible for any loss sustained by any person who relies on this presentation.